Hello everyone. Please confirm in chat whether you can see my screen. Hello. Could you please? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So thank you. Hello everyone. I'm Akash, and I'll be covering 3 topics in deluge for you. We'll go through webhooks or the invoke URL command. Then we'll look at connections. We'll go through webhooks and connections, and then we'll look at how deluge is used in some Zoho services in general or no overview. So we start with webhooks. So webhooks are automated messages that are sent from one website to or web application to another when something happens, like a notification of an action or operation in the app. Or more generally, as we are using the term here, it's a request sent over the web to retrieve or send information between 2 different services. These requests can have a body or payload, and they're sent to another app or website using what is called a web request. We will look at how to make such web requests in Deluge using the invoke URL command. We've already looked at get URL and post URL in earlier sessions. Excuse me. And invoke URL is similar, but it gives you more options and control. So this is the basic syntax in Deluge of the invoke URL command. It shows the 2 required options, URL and request type or request method. The URL, of course, specifies where to send the request, and it must start with HTTP or HTTPS, which is the address format used on the web. I'll go over all the options in invoke URL in the next set of slides, and then we'll look at a demonstration of how they work. So the type or method of the request can be one of the following values. So these are the supported methods. There are other types of methods over HTTP, but we don't support them, and they're not used very often. So get is used to retrieve information from a web app or website. For example, when you go to zoho.com, your browser makes get requests to show you the homepage. And when you use post, you send information to an app or website. For example, when you're submitting a HTML form on a website, it sends your information with a post request. Put is used to update. The others are less common. Put is used to update a resource, but some web apps and sites use post for this. So depending on the service, they might use put or they might use post for changing the resource. Patch is used for changing, partially changing a resource. For example, certain sections of a file or some lines. Delete, as the name says, is used to ask the web service to delete a resource, remove a resource. These request methods are defined as conventions that are agreed upon. So what that means is there is nothing preventing a web app or website from deleting something when you make a get request. But of course, that's not done because it doesn't make sense. It's a convention that's followed. Now we look at how to send parameters. So parameters are used to send information that the website might need to process your request. There are different kinds of parameters, and we look at them in detail in a bit. There's also this thing called request header. So they're used to send more information about your request, and that is not part of the body or parameters. It can contain information about how to interpret the data in the body, or it can include authorization information that authenticates your request, that tells the service who you are and whether, so that it can check whether you have access to whatever you're asking for. There is also content type, and that tells the website or application how to interpret the data in the body or payload of the request. The content type can contain any value, but there are standard values that are defined and they're commonly used. Some examples are multi-part form data. and this indicates that the request body is formatted in a specific way, and it can contain one or more sections with boundaries between each section, and they can contain different types of content in each part. When you submit a web form with different types of contents, example text fields and as well as a file upload, this is the type of request that is generally used to send that information. X-World Web Form URL encoded is another kind of similar format, also used by web forms, and it uses a special encoding scheme for the body of the request. Octet stream is for sending binary data or file information that is unknown. So example, you don't know what the file type is or what the source is, you just set it as an octet stream and send the binary information as it is. Application/JSON is used to tell the website that you're sending a JSON content and that it should be processed as such. Text/plain is for just plain text, like a text file or general readable text information, human readable text. There are multiple subtypes under text. You have text/HTML, etc. And these types and subtypes are formally known as MIME types, and you can think of them as file extensions for the web, just descriptions of file information. So invoke URL also allows you to send files, and this is the syntax that you see: files : and then the file object or a list of file objects. You can see in the example we're using just a string value and we're converting it to a to-file with a file name and just using that. So what to-file does is takes your variable and converts it to a file object, so that it can be sent in the invoke URL command. Of course, it's not possible to upload a file and use that in the deluge script. It has to be either generated in the script or it can be retrieved from another website URL using invoke URL. Now, detailed responses, when you set detail to true, the response variable that is saved here will contain more information than you would normally get. For example, in this URL, we are calling the inventory API and asking for a list of organizations. Note that we're just trying to request this with a GET, and there is no additional information there's no additional authentication information. So this request is basically going to fail. And in the following slide, you can see that response. So it has three parts. It's a map with a response text, and the content inside the response text is what you would normally get if you didn't set detail to true. That's what you would normally receive in the response. But when you set detail to true, you get this more complex response. Response header, just as we can set request headers, we can also receive request headers. The website can send us headers in the body, in the response. And then there is a response code, which in this case is 401. So the response code is a HTTP status code that tells you the status of the request you made. 401 in this case means access denied because either you sent an invalid authentication info or you didn't send it at all. So it gives you this status code. Successful requests will have status codes in the 200 range. So now I'll do a demo of what we have seen so far with invoke URL. So I'm going to do this in Click. I could do it in any other product with a deluge custom function, but I've chosen to do it in Click, where I will go to bots and tools here, and we'll go to commands. So commands are slash commands allow you to run a deluge code from within a chat window. So just a quick way of executing a script. And you can see it has a response map predefined, and you have a response variable here. So it will expect a return response. So I'll just rewrite this. Now when I run this, you can see it pre-fills the slash and the command name from within chat. When I enter, it shows me the response from the command. This is not posted to this chat. But if I click post here, the response will be sent in this chat as a message. So that is just a quick context of the click command / commands. So I'll start with a example with a simple get request. Let's save it in a variable called resp. Response, the word response is already used. So I'm just going to use resp info. And for this example, I'm going to use a third-party tool, which is a request inspector, requestinspector.com, that allows you to inspect a request coming from a website when you make a request to this. So what this will allow us to do is look at the invoke URL, what the invoke URL command does from the other side, from the service that is being called. So it can make it easier to visualize how this works and easier to understand. It will also help you see how the invoke command handles specific cases. So I'm going to use this URL here. Type is get uppercase. Move to other options. Now when I run this command, I'm infoing the response. So I get an OK from the request inspector side. And when I go back there, you can see what it received from my deluge script, from the invoke URL command. So you can see the method here, and it specifies the paths that it was received at, and the host or the website. And then after the host line, you have a bunch of values. So this is the header of the request. You can see that when we run invoke URL, some headers are pre-filled. For example, it says user agent is deluge to indicate to the service that it's being called through deluge. And we also have another custom header, x-zoho from service, Zoho chat. This is not really required, but we send it. And you can also add custom headers and they'll appear here. So that was a simple get request. Now I'm going to add params to this request. Two values. And apply it under parameters. When I make this request, you can see what changes. So first we'll note that this params was sent as a map. So it was just supplied as a map or JSON value. And we'll see what the invoke URL command does with that. So you can see it's a little different from the earlier example. And the only difference is that the query string part after the question mark, where you can see that it supplied the values with key equals value and each pair separated with an ampersand. So this is how query strings are formatted, and the ampersand is a special character. It's used to separate the different pairs of keys and values. So let's just see what happens when one of the keys or values actually has a literal ampersand inside it. Now I'll trigger that. And you'll see something different happen here. So it has done something special here. This is called percent encoding or URL encoding. You can see it converted the space to %20, and it converted the ampersand to %26 and another space, which is the value we supplied. And this is how the invoke URL command automatically handles special characters in the query string. So now we'll try adding headers. So I'll create another map. Note that headers cannot have, the header key cannot have any spaces. And I'm going to include it under headers and supply the map variable. You got that. And again, it's the same as before, but now when we look in this list of headers, it has supplied the value that I set. So this allows you to specify custom headers if you want to, or if the service you're calling requires a specific header. Now let's change this to a post. I'll remove this, and we just change this to a post. And now we look at the content here. So you can see now the params moved from the URL in the query string to the body or payload. So after the headers, there'll be some new lines, and then you'll have the actual body being sent. And you can see there is a new content type here, which invoke URL is automatically set, even though we supplied a map value, and it has converted our map value or literal map value into key value pairs. And you'll notice that the encoding for space is slightly different under this URL encoded format. World Wide Web form URL encoded, and supplies the value there. And if we add an and in the post, you'll see that it used the same URL encoding scheme for the ampersand. So you can use %20 or a plus depending on the scheme being used. Now we look at the content type just by adding a content type option. Content type colon. Then I'll supply a sample value. Now it's saved. It gives me an error on save saying parameters required string found map. So when I set a content type, it refuses to take a map param. So I'll fix that by changing to a string. Save that. Now it saves. I can go to execute. Let's look at what happened what it did in the request editor. So now you can see content type is set to test type, and because we set a string, we didn't send a map. It changes the way it processed that. It did not process the map at all. It sent it exactly as it is. So if you actually want to send a map variable as it is, you have to convert it to a string or text value first within invoke URL. And my content type has been set. Again, that is just a sample. You wouldn't actually use the predefined values depending on what you're sending. Now we'll set details to true. And execute. This won't change the request format, but the response that we get should include more information. So now, instead of just the OK, which is in the response text, we got a full map containing the text, the header, as well as the code. 200 for 200 OK. It worked successfully. And these happen to be the headers that this particular website sets. Gives you more information about the server or how to make the next request, etc. So now that we have seen content type and detailed equals true, we'll remove the rest. We'll look at how to send a file. So I'll use a similar example as in the slide. So this is a text file, which is actually a string. And then I'm going to convert that variable to a file object. And And notice that I haven't supplied a extension. I'm just going to leave it as it is without an extension, so it doesn't know what type of file it is. And add the files option and include my file variable, file object. So execute that. Is okay again. Now I can look at what it sent, and you can see content type. Set it to multi-part form data with a boundary and a special key. So this value is just used to separate the different parts if there is more than one. So you can see it starts with that exact same boundary value. It sets the content disposition form data. File name is my file, and it set content type for this particular part as application/octet string, because it's just a file object, doesn't know what it is. And the content of the file, and an ending boundary which has two trailing hyphens at the end to indicate that that's the end of the request to indicate to this website. And that's how you would send a file with a files option. Now I'll demonstrate adding what happens when we add a file extension. Now it succeeded again. I'll go back, and you can see, of course, the file name changed and content type was changed to txt. The rest is the same, but this was changed. Now this is actually not the prescribed value for a text file or for a plain text content. It should actually be text/plain, but the invoke URL command would have to inspect the contents of the file to determine what to use. It doesn't do that. It just uses the extension if there is one. So we can actually, and this can cause problems depending on the web service website you're trying to interact with or send the file to. This can be a problem. So we'll also see how to fix that. Now you might first try to find an option inside invoke URL, but you don't really do that there. You actually change it at the file level. I'm going to call a command function called set file type, and I'm going to provide the value that I want to send as content type, which is text/plain, which is correct, prescribed value, and it says okay. And the rest of the request is the same, except that content type was overridden with my custom value. Now we've seen how to send one file. Let's try to send two files. Use the same format. And supply in files, I'm going to use file and file2 as a list of file objects. This is actually not going to work correctly. I'm going to show you how to fix that. It says okay, sends it, and I can see the latest request, and it only has the second file. That's because the parameter name was not set for each file, and I'll show you how to fix that. For example, each file object, set param name, I can give it any value, any valid value, and I'm just calling it file1, file2. I'll execute the same request again with just those changes, and you should see the next request actually does have two files. I forgot to set the content type for this one, but you can see it added another parameter name, file1 and file2. And this is what the server would expect, and it can access these files. If you want your code on a server level to access it, you can reference it by this value. So far we have seen all options of the invoke URL command in the request inspector to see the details of how deluge handles the invoke URL command, handles the input that you give it, and what the results are. Hopefully it should be a bit clearer how this command works and what actually happens in the background. Now we'll use a more real world example. I'll explain from the very basics. I'll start with a bad example and then show you what the correct way to do it is. Let's say I want to fetch a list of headlines or news articles that I want to process inside an app. I go to a news site. And you can see the news. Quite depressing. Go to travel. So you can see a list of different articles, page formatting, etc. Now I will very naively copy this, which actually gives me a page as a response. Put that here, set it to get, and do a simple request to that URL. This is obviously not the proper way to do it. And it makes a request, then you get an HTML file, of course. And it doesn't really help you retrieve the information that you want, because while the file has a structure, the structure is meant for the browser to display the content with layouts and paragraphs, styles and images, etc. It doesn't really define the content with meaningful tags, the meaning of the content. So now that we've seen a very simple example of why you actually need an API, let's search for the actual news API. And we have a quick example with newsapi.org. And it's a free API that gives you a list in JSON format, which clearly describes what is inside, along with source, author, title, description, everything. You can see tells you the total number of results and an articles list. So they have two APIs. One is V2's everything and just top headlines. So I'll just use this as an example. Copy that whole URL and paste it here. And you'll notice that they require an API key. So you have to register for an API key. It's still a free API, but as Surinder mentioned yesterday, they would still like to track usage, and they also have pricing. So I've already actually signed up and got myself an API key. I'll copy it from here. And you can see as in the basic example, they just provided it, they just supply it in the URL. Define that variable I just used. And that's one of the ways you can access this API. Basically provide them information about who's asking, and so they know that you actually should have access. Now, for many reasons, providing a security key or API key in the request params in a GET is bad practice. It's not really supposed to be done for a whole host of reasons. This can be bookmarked, it can appear in history. There are a whole number of reasons why it's normally not done. In this case, it doesn't really matter. So and some ways of calling this API might only allow you to supply a value in the URL. So they support that as well. So this is just one way that they allow you to authenticate your request. Probably made a mistake with an ampersand, yes. Now I've included it as part of the query param, separated with an ampersand. And you can see the results coming from that API. I can process this using the collection functions or the map functions, .get JSON, etc. I can do .get articles. I can loop through that. It gives you that much control. That's simply because the structure is predefined. You know what it is, and it describes, and even by just looking at it, because it describes what's inside, what it's about. It's easy to work with, and that's basically why we have web APIs. The problem I showed you earlier, easily exchanging information, performing operations. So in very simple terms, if you have had trouble understanding the way this works or why we do certain things. Now, as I mentioned, the API key is only one way they allow that. If we look at their documentation and go to authentication, they specify API key in the query string, and they also accept it in a custom header called x-API key. Generally, when something starts with x-, it's a custom header, though that's no longer practiced. And they also accept the same value in the authorization HTTP header. This authorization header happens to be a part of a predefined standard that's commonly used. And it can have either the key value or bearer space and the value. So this is called a bearer token in the authorization header. It's also used by multiple APIs. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove that API key from the URL. When I try to run it now, it gives me that same error, key missing. Now I can supply that key by adding it in the header. So they said x-API-key and then the value. That's my header, and I include the headers option. Now it works because we included that custom header. So this is the second way they accept that value. They also mentioned that they accept the value inside the default authorization header, and that value must be or can be error plus the space plus the API key. Let's run it again. Just as I said, this works too. So there are multiple ways of authenticating your requests with HTTP and the authorization header. There are standards for it. One of them is basic, which actually, instead of taking a key, it takes a username and password. It's outdated for, I guess, the same reason. So your basic value would be, authentication value would be something like your username separated by a colon, and your password. So username, colon, password. And generally, you would encode this with a encoding called base64. And that value would end up looking like this. That's the encoded value. Doesn't really provide any security because anybody can decode this back to the original value. That's a standard. And how you would provide it is authorization basic space and that encoded value, which is basically your username and password. Now, the problem with providing a username and password is, firstly, you're giving your username and password away. And apart from that, you're using all the permissions of your account. You cannot, the advantage with the API keys, the service can limit the access levels or the operations that you can perform with this key. It says for this key, you can only add, or you can only read, you can't delete, or you can only access these certain pieces of information. It can have greater control over that. And that's, I guess, that is why basic is not as common. Now, there is another way of authentication called OAuth and OAuth 2. OAuth 2 is special in the sense an API key like this is generally valid indefinitely. It's just created and it'll always work, or it's valid for a large amount of time. And you can't really control access that easily. With OAuth 2, what it does is it gives you an access token as well as a refresh token. And the access token is what you use to authenticate your request. And the difference is it expires every now and then, generally about an hour. So whenever it expires, you can't use the old key anywhere. So even if somebody stole your key or it was published by mistake somewhere, it will no longer be valid after a while. And you need the refresh token value as well as other pieces of information that you use to register for that service to generate a new access token. And that process is an ongoing process that is triggered every time you make the API call. You check whether it's valid, and if it's not, create a new key, and it's generally much more secure. And that is possible to do in Deluge. You just have to write the code every time to check, store the tokens, and generate it before you actually make the request, the main request. Now, now that we have understood how authentication works in general, it'll be easier to understand connections and the advantages. So one big disadvantage with writing authentication like this in Deluge is your key is in the script. Anyone that can see the script or access this will have that authentication code. So that's one disadvantage of not using connections. What connections allow you to do is basically hide all of this information and provide it dynamically with the connections param. So now we're going to look at connections. So connections are not supported in Deluge. Connections are not supported in all products. Some have them, some don't. Generally, you'll find it wherever you have, either in settings or like in Click, you have it right here at the bottom left. And when I go there, you'll see manage connections. I click add, and the first thing it asks me is to select a service. And these are the default services that are predefined. So for example, if you want to connect Eventbrite, you can directly create a connection. Or if you look at something that has scopes, say if you want to connect to your Google account, select Google, and here are the scopes. So some of the services have scopes, and you can select exactly which parts of your Google account this connection can access. So you have the control right here. Excuse me. And in general, it's not a good idea to select more scopes than you really need, because that's just extra access that it doesn't need, can be misused if anything bad happens. So that's how you would create a default service connection. You also have the option of creating a custom service. Not all Zoho products allow custom services, but I guess we'll include that soon. So when you create a custom service, of course, have to specify the custom service name. And you can select the authentication type that service uses. Now for this news API, we already saw that they support API key, and none of the others. They don't support basic authentication, and they don't support OAuth 1 and OAuth 2. So the one big advantage of connections is an easy way to create an OAuth 2 connection. You provide all the secret information for that access information along with the refresh token URL. So with this information, the connection will automatically keep that access token updated. It will call that refresh token, receive the new access token, and keep it saved in a safe place so that it can be used through the connection. Now I'll continue configuring this API service. Since we know that the news API uses an API key, we're going to select that, and it allows you to control where in the request, whether in the query string, in the form data, the body, or the header. We know that it allows it in the query string, but we're not going to use that. We're going to say header and use that header value. Correct. So this is the actual parameter name, and you probably want to put the API key here, but that's not how this works. This is the display name. So we are actually configuring the service, and you would put instructions for your field here. Something like that. And connection details. So far up till this, we've provided the service information, and this is our actual connection name. So I'm just going to give it a new name. So it does both at the same time, creates a service as well as creates a connection. And we have this checkbox here. So this is not always available in all services. Some have this option, some don't. Where they don't, it's considered to be off. Now, what this does is if you select use credentials of login user, whoever tries to use your connection will have to fill their own API key information. So it will use their account to authenticate the invoke URL command. If you don't select this, you just configure connect it once, and whoever uses the connection basically uses your authentication code for accessing that API. So you're going to select enable this, click create and connect, and you'll see connections created, and it wants to open a pop-up. So I'm going to show that pop-up, and you can see it goes to deluge auth, and shows me a form with my configuration for the parameter. And this is where I put my API key. So when I click save details, it processes that, and now it says connected. Now, the whole word connections can be a little misleading. It simply provides the authentication information for the get URL function whenever it is triggered with this option here. It doesn't maintain a connection or actually perform a connection to the service. It's just a way of storing your authentication information in a safe place and using it in invoke URL. So I'm just going to, or at least copy this part and go back, close this, go back to my command, and you can see I've removed my API key from the request. I'm just going to type connection and give the connection name that I just created. Save, it saves, and then when I run it, it detects a change to my API call with a new connection. So it asks me for permission, proceed to allow, and it actually authenticates and gives me the response just with the connection and the connection name here. I don't have to include my API key in the code, do any gymnastics for OAuth 2, etc. Takes care of all of that. So that covers connections. And now we'll move on to deluge in other Zoho services. So there are actually more than 30 Zoho services that support deluge, or nearly 30. And it's only a matter of configuring their workflows to have them trigger a deluge custom function. I'm going to use, for my example, Zoho People, which is an HR management solution. We use it ourselves. Okay, so it's loaded now. And in general, in most Zoho services that support deluge, if you go to settings, generally at the top right or in a panel like this, it will give you the setup, which is fairly standardized across Zoho products. And if you look under automation, you'll find workflows, that may allow you to trigger custom actions. For example, if I edit a workflow, if I look in, apart from the actual triggering process, the conditions that it checks for, etc. If you find custom functions in the list of actions that that workflow can trigger, then that product does support deluge. And not just custom functions, we also have, in people, we have scheduler. Not every product may have a scheduler. And if you click add scheduler, you can see that the schedule action can trigger a deluge custom function. So people also has schedulers that trigger deluge. And it also has custom action buttons. So you can have a button action on a record that triggers a custom function, but it doesn't come under automation. It'll come under module customization. You can have a custom action button. So I have already created, excuse me, I've already created an example that basically processes a travel request, or specifically a travel expense. So when you add a travel request, and after you've created that, you add an expense for that request, which is in this format with columns for each category. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the sum of all of these values for that particular employee, and I'm going to update a custom field in the employee form or the employee module. So I'll quickly look at settings, customization forms, and employee. I've actually already added the field. Yeah, so here it is, total travel expense per employee. So it'll be a automatically calculated sum of every travel expense entry that will be saved for that employee. And you can see the field, the table column name here. I just remembered that I also have to, for my previous example, I also have to go and set that value back to 0. So I'm just going to edit this record, and there is a value here. So I'm just going to set it back to 0. So it's obvious how it, so the function looks correct. Now, what I've done already is I've configured a workflow rule on the expense form and some expense, and I'm going to edit it and show you the structure of a automation workflow. So you have name, status, of course, and which action to trigger this workflow on: record, edit, create, field update, etc. Approval, rejection, delete. You can also set a criteria. Then you have the action section, as we saw earlier. You have non-deluge actions that you can perform, like send an email, update a checklist, update a field, etc. But you can see in custom functions, I've already linked a custom function. If there's nothing here, you can create a custom function by clicking the plus and configure it here. So now I'll edit that function, the linked function, and you can see the script that I wrote. And it'll be easier if I indent this properly. Now, in the function, you have to edit params, and what it allows you to do is pull information from that particular entry that triggered the workflow. So in this case, it allows you to automatically select related information about the travel expense. The expense, the travel request for which the expense was, you can access that table info, the employee table. Right now, I'm just going to fetch the actual travel expense entry, because that's what contains my subdivided totals for each category. And I've selected Zoho ID, which is the record ID in that module, and storing it as a expense ID param. So that's already done. And for it can be a bit tricky to write a code like this if you're not completely familiar with the modules and what the structure is. And it can also be difficult to trigger it with the right value. So what I did here earlier when I was building this is I preset the value with a valid travel expense ID. And the way I got that ID was just, instead of using the get record by ID function, I used the get record function to get the whole list of travel expenses, look at the structure, and copy a valid ID from there so that I could test the function and make sure that it works correctly. There is a little bit of trial and error there when you're writing something like this. So first line uses the built-in integration with Zoho people. So this does not need your authentication information. It automatically uses the admin's authentication, or if you're writing the script for the first time, whoever is creating the script, it generates authentication for that user and uses that. So get record by ID, I'm selecting the module and giving the ID, which I've got from the workflow. That will give me the full detailed collection or JSON response. And after inspecting it, looking at the content, I saw that the expenses are actually in a tabular section, which contains the subdivided categories. And there is a subsection called expense. Tabular sections in the expense module has only one section called expense. It could have had it. I think maybe there was an intention to have more, but it just gets one. And for each expense detail and expense details, again, this is just one row. I'm doing a for each, but as you saw in the table when I was submitting it, it just allows one line there. So actually this loop just runs once. And I have created a key list with all the column headers or keys of the values that I want, setting an expense total to 0. If this loop actually ran multiple times, this would go outside there. I'll just keep it there because it's clearer. It's more correct. And then I go through this list of keys of that map, and then I get the corresponding value dynamically using the variable key. I could have written this as say and provided the values like this, and with one line for each. And repeated that many times to get the corresponding values. But I think this is cleaner to just put it easier to read as a list and then a dynamic key here. Neater. And then after I get the expense value, I check if it's empty or null. If it's not, then I include it in the addition. So I convert that string value to a decimal value and add it up. So when we reach the end of this loop, expense total will contain all the travel expenses, the sum of all the different travel expenses. And then what I do is I get the employee ID of the person that submitted the expense from the same expense response. And then I get that employee's entry. I'm doing this step because I want if there is an existing value in total travel expense, I want to increment from there. I don't want to overwrite it, so it has to be, I need the existing value as well. So I have existing total, employee record.get. This is my custom field. And then I check again if the existing total is blank or null. Not. Made a mistake. So when there are two not conditions, the operator should be ampersand, and expense total is equal to expense total plus the same line there with the existing total. Then I check if emp ID is not equal to null, and then I do an update. So I create an update map which contains the record ID field to the employee ID. This determines which record is updated, and this is the field to update and the corresponding value. So when I call the .update command for the employee module and give it this map. It gets that employee ID and updates this field. And that's the script for summing up a list of travel expenses and saving it in a column. So I can show you an example just so you know it does work. Add record. And I'll go back to the entry and have this. Now I'm going to add a third expense, another expense. I'm just going to, so it's currently 1749. I'm going to select travel request for it, submit, and it should go to 1849. And it did. So that proves that function is correct and it's working as intended. So that is how you would use a custom function and workflow. I haven't really looked at custom action buttons, but they're very similar. You create a button, bind it to a custom function. When you click the button, it does essentially the same operation as a workflow. So that's Zoho people workflows. Now I am almost out of time, but I will be covering Click, Zoho Click, deluge and Zoho Click in some more detail. So we've already looked at the slash command. That's what I used to demonstrate the invoke URL. And I'll start with this again. I have an existing, another slash command called headlines, which uses the same news API. I'll edit that and explain some more options that exist for slash commands. So you can see this code does almost the same thing what we did earlier. Get the articles, goes through each article. And in the beginning you have if selections.size, but you notice that selections is not defined anywhere. So what Click does is with its deluge handlers, what are called handlers, it has predefined objects that are pre-filled by Click depending on the context. So when you click this command, type a value after the slash command, you get a list of so these are the suggestions for this command. So I can select the category. Yeah, select the category, and when I trigger the command, you can see that it outputs a table with sports news because I selected that. Now that list of options is defined in the command's suggestion handler. So if I go there, you can see I have a list and I have a map with a title, which is the title value business. It has an image URL, and then I add that map to the list, another map with another option added to the list, a third option added to the list, and then I return the list. So this code defines what options Click displays in the command. And when I actually execute the command in the execution handler, it pre-fills the selections that are made, that the user made in this object. So so the selection will have the title, selections, first selection.get title, and then I just add that as a category to the API URL. It also has multiple other predefined objects that allow you to check other options. I don't have the time to go in depth into all of that. But it also has options. For example, I had this would be an option, and then the value. This would be another option, and the value. And when I execute it, I can access those corresponding hyphen options with the options map. It shows up here, just like the selections that work for the tips. And you might wonder how I managed to format it like this. So I'll just quickly go over that. So I create a row map, a row list, and then I go through all the articles from the API response. In the link, I use a click markup, text markup, to define a clickable link. So you can see it has a square bracket, the text, and then in the parentheses, you would actually provide the URL. So this is dynamically generated. And in the title column, I put the article link. Source, I put the source value, and add it to the row list. And it adds all the rows into the row list. Then when I return a response from this command to click for it to display the values in the chat, it has the chat text message, and then it has a predefined option called slides. You have different types supported by click: slide, card, multiple other options. And then inside the slide content, I have type table title, and then the data. I've defined the headers as title and source, which you'll see at the top. Table header, and this is the actual text that is returned in the response. And rows, which is the row list. So based on the row list values, it outputs that in this table. That's how that works. So we've looked at / commands, both the execution handler and the suggestion tips. And I'll go back to the main set of deluge options in Click. So we've looked at commands. I'll go to bots. Now you can create a bot and subscribe to it, and it will appear just like a contact would in your list of chats. And if I go to the settings, you can see the bot has a API endpoint. So a third-party service can send a message to the bot, and that message will be displayed via the bot to whoever is subscribed to it. It also has a notification webhook, and you can set the access level. Now I'll go to edit handlers, and we see a bunch of handlers. These are all individual deluge scripts that are triggered by click whenever something is sent to the bot. For example, when you subscribe to a bot, the welcome handler is triggered. If I look at the code, it's quite straightforward. It has the same response for the chat, and there is a predefined variable. New users can be either true or false. So you can know whether the user unsubscribed and then subscribed again. So if it's a new user, give them a different message. If they're coming back after unsubscribing and subscribing again, gives them a different message. So as simple as that. It works. The basic response text is just like the / command we saw earlier. So that's the welcome handler. I'll cover message handler and context handler together at the end. So the mention handler is when you mention the bot with an @ in any chat conversation, it will trigger the bot's mention handler. And if you go into the code and if you press Control space, you'll see the predefined objects or variables that Click applies to that bot, to this handler. So when you mention the bot, if you access the message, the bot can get the content of the message in which you mentioned it. You can get other mentions, etc. And you can perform actions and return a response within the chat. The bot will basically reply to you. And incoming webhook handler is the piece of code that runs when we saw there was a URL earlier for notifying the bot about something. So it says you received a HTTP call from, and you can see the predefined values for this handler. Now we'll look at, and then you also have a menu. You can edit the menus, submenus, and you can edit the code. And there is a sub action which is defined that tells you which submenu was clicked. And then bot can perform some action and return a response. And you can have multiple top-level menus as well. Now we'll go look at message handler and context handler, because that's more detailed and more interesting. Now, a message handler is simply triggered when you send a message to the bot directly. And here you can check whether the message contains attachments, etc., as well as the message content. So here you can see there's a check for what the message contains. If it says contains hi, hello, etc. So let's just see how that works. I say hi, and the bot replies. And in this case, apart from the text, you're returning a suggestion list, which contains 2 different options, and the bot displays it like this. So what that means is the message handler probably has a handler for you selecting either of these. So the thing about message handlers is you need a if check for every value of message that you are handling. You have to check every time what it says and perform an action. That's why suggestions make it easier to see what the bot supports, what responses it expects for this. Now, the message handler is basically triggered every time you message the bot, and I'll show you a problem with that. And message handler doesn't have any information about the previous message. So for example, if I check in the message handler, if the message equals yes, I'll do something. But the problem with this is there's no way of knowing in the message handler yes, but to what? There's no way of knowing the context of this yes. It'll just go, every time you type a yes, it'll go into this handler and run that code. That's how that works. And this problem of knowing the context or what question is being answered is handled by the context handler. And the context handler is triggered whenever you return a message to the chat that contains a context object. And each context has an ID, a unique ID that identifies that context. And it's easier to understand what this is if you think of context just as a questionnaire. It's literally just a set of questions, and when you return the context, the bot asks for that information. For example, you have the context ID, how long the context is active for before it expires, and then the params of the context. As you can see, each parameter is a question. So the name is please enter, the question is please enter your name, age, how old are you? And what happens is when you return this context, the context handler takes over and checks for the context ID from this object and collects all the information asked here, and then it triggers itself again with the response. So as you can see, this context handler is triggered by the keyword ticket in the message. So if I type ticket, give me that message and switches to that context set of questions. I'm answering those questions, and once I finish answering the full set of questions, it triggered the context handler and returned me that the context handler's response. So now if we look at the context handler, you can see it's a similar script which checks the context ID. This is the value of the context returned by the message handler. So it knows you can separate it into different contexts, different questionnaires, and it compiles from an answers object what all you wrote for each answer, and then returns a response. So that's pretty much how context works. It's not more or less complicated than this. So now I think we've looked at bots, how bots work. Let's see, skip commands. We look at message actions. Message actions are very simple. It's a piece of code that is triggered when you click on a particular message, any message in any chat. And you can see the default options here. But if you go to more for this message, I can trigger this action. If I trigger this action, you have performed an action. This is the response that the message action took. So I can click on any message, trigger a custom workflow on it, and maybe forward it somewhere else or save it somewhere, perform some action on that. And you can see, you can access attachments in that message for which you triggered the action, etc. Now we have functions. Now click functions. These are function handlers. These are not the same as custom functions in Deluge and other services. They don't work the same way, and you cannot call them directly from within a Deluge script in anywhere else. These are specifically bound to forms or buttons that you display in a chat. So button function is easier. I'll start with that. Edit code. And it's basically a piece of code that triggers when you click a button. And it has helpfully given me an example here. You can see it follows the same markup for the clickable URL, but instead of a URL, you have command invoke.function pipe and then the button name and button function name, which is the same as this. So I'm going to copy this and let's open a new tab. Go back, bots and tools, and I'll create a button, display a button, and trigger that button action from a command. So I'll go back to my command code. I'll remove all this, and in the response content text, I'll just return that link. And when I run this command, the response from the command shows me a button. Now we'll just go back here. Isn't the instant button blah blah blah? It gives me a message when I click a button. So when I click that, that's the button function running and giving me a response. So you can do any action from a button displayed in a chat. So that's basically a button handler function. And then you also have a form handler function, form function, which is a bit more complicated. Edit code. Now again, they've helpfully given us a sample form here. So correction here, this function invoked function name must match this. So I'm making that change here. And if I copy this into my command, as you can see, we're creating a list and we are adding multiple map objects to that list, and we're basically defining fields, multiple fields, email field, text field, and different types of input fields. This is an options field, select drop down, and there's also a trigger on change, which is true, that goes into a dynamic form handler. I'll explain how that works. So we're basically creating fields and then creating a form object and supplying those fields into the previous fields list into the inputs. And this particular form object triggers my form function. So now this form, I'm just going to comment this and say response equals form from response. Now when I trigger this action, it shows me a form, and you can see it's exactly as it was defined, and it actually has dynamic handlers for dynamic fields, and when I select different options, it actually dynamically populates different values. So all this is handled by the single form function with different handlers. So when I go back to my form function, you can see it actually has 3 sections: form submit, form change, and dynamic field. And if you go to dynamic field, you can see that it's triggered with the field options, and it checks the field values, creates a list of options, and returns that list of options back to the form to change the display. And when you have form change handler, this controls the list of options displayed, gets the form values whenever the dynamic field handler changed. This is triggered, and it adds a new field, removes 2 existing fields. In the other case, it adds the fields. It can dynamically change the structure of the form. Now the form that we are seeing is just a UI. It doesn't really save data anywhere. Everything happens within the deluge handlers, the function handler. And when I'll finally show you what happens when we actually submit the form. Click raise request, and you can see the form submit handler, this part in the my form function. It ran, it got the values out from the form and displayed the selections, whatever I submitted here. So that's quite cool, I think, what Click has done with Deluge. So we've covered function handlers. As you can see, they're not the same as Deluge custom functions. They're tightly integrated with click buttons and forms. Then you have a couple of other simple options. Just quickly cover them, and that then will be done. So we have a scheduler. You can configure when it runs, edit the code, and you can send a post to a bot. You have different posting options: post to user, bot, chat, channel. Of course, you can do anything in the script. You can call APIs, change other things, or you can send messages. So you can send a good morning message every day. Just a simple example. Then you have databases. I've already created a simple DB. Now, if you look at the options, you can see they have samples for how to add or update information. You can see it uses the same format as other Zoho products: .create record, get records, get record by ID. But in Click, what we're dealing with is actually custom databases created that you have to create first. You have to provide the database name. And if you actually edit the DB, so it's basically a single table. You can't have multiple tables. It's just a form, and you have only 3 types: text, number, Boolean. I have added 3 fields, and you can see that there's a maximum of 5 of each for a total of 15 fields. So I have 4 out of 5 left, and I'm not sure how much data or rows it allows you to add. I don't have that info. But it's designed just for simple use case for storing simple values that a bot might need or a command might need. Any of the other things. So extensions are basically a bundle of bots, commands, functions, message actions that you can group together, and just as it says, you publish it, and then someone can install it and get all of those the entire set of commands that you selected in one go. I don't have the creation option here, but it's fairly straightforward. That's all it does, really. You can publish it and other people can install it. So that concludes my demo session about deluge and Zoho services, invoke URL. I hope that was useful and easy to follow, I hope. I'll be transferring control to Ramya whenever she's ready and to take over for the next and final session. Thank you.
Oh, hello everyone. Can you please confirm if you can hear me and is my screen audible? See, is my screen visible? Okay. Okay. Okay, let's then start the session. So hello everyone, I'm Ramya. So at this point, I believe you would have started to get familiar with Deluge, like how it is implemented in Zoho Creator and how integrations are performed and how Deluge can be used in different services like Click and Zoho People. So now in this session, let us continue to understand how Deluge can be used in different Zoho services. So Deluge Editor is available in around 25 Zoho services, which means you can perform automation and customize your accounts in those services easily using Deluge. So in our session, let's consider two of Zoho services, Zoho Books and Zoho Desk, for us to understand Deluge's capabilities in services other than Zoho Creator. So what is Zoho Books? Like most of you all might already know, Zoho Books is an accounting software that allows you to manage all your incomes and expenses smartly. And what does that mean? So imagine you're running a food manufacturing business. So you'll have a group of vendors who will sell you raw materials, and you'll have to process those raw materials into consumable finished food products. And then you'll have to sell them to your customers. So this is pretty much your job, and you have a lot of money flowing in and out of your business that you'll need to keep track of. This is where Zoho Books comes into play. Using Books, you can perform complete accounting that is required for your business. And why do you need Deluge here? So Deluge allows you to customize and automate your account according to with respect to your accounting needs. So let's consider an example. To maintain a healthy customer relationship, you always provide your customers with multiple interesting discounts. And one such discount is providing 10% offer for all the invoice that exceeds $3,000. So instead of providing the appropriate amount in the discount field every time an invoice exceeds $3,000, you can simply automate this using deluge. So to be precise, you will have to write a custom function that is triggered by a workflow. The custom function defines the action that you want to perform, and the workflow defines when to trigger the custom function. So in our case, the custom function defines when providing 10% discount, and the workflow defines when to trigger the custom function, as in like whenever an invoice exceeds $3,000. So custom function is where you'll want to write deluge, and writing the custom function is not as difficult as it sounds. You can perform that in 3 simple steps. The first step is to fetch the subtotal amount from the invoice, and then you will have to calculate the discount amount. So this can be done by using simple math. So if you multiply 0.10 with the subtotal amount that you fetched in the previous step, you will get the discount amount. So that is 10% of the subtotal price. The next step is to update the discount field with the calculated discount amount. For that, we're going to make use of an integration task, which is Zoho Books Update Records task. So if you notice, we are using an integration task to update a record. So integration task doesn't just serve the purpose of communicating between 2 services, but also you can use integration task as an in-house data access tool to perform basic operations that deals with data. So let's check how this can be done. I have now logged into my Zoho Books account. So navigate to the settings icon that is in top right corner. And click on automation. Click on custom functions and click create new custom function button. So here, let's provide a custom function a name. Let me call it discount. And then let's provide an optional description. Let me call it provide a 10% discount. And then let us choose the module upon which we want this custom function to be acted. So in our case, it is invoice. Let's choose invoice from here. And let's now talk about the title bar of the deluge editor. This part is the header of the custom function that we are writing. So discount is the name given to the custom function based on the function name that we've provided here. And invoice, organization, and user are the input parameters that are supplied based on the module that we have chosen here, which is invoice. So if you try and click on the first input parameter, invoice, it lists all the keys corresponding to the specified module. So in our case, it is invoice. And you can think of these keys to be as a unique name provided to the fields in the selected module, and all the data will be stored against this keys. So it is easy for you to identify and fetch the required value based on these keys. So the second input parameter, organization, holds the details of the organization that you're part of. And Zoho Books allows you to be in more than one, part of more than one organization at the same time. So this is really helpful when you want to fetch details of the current organization. And finally, the last input parameter holds the detail of the users, including the user ID, username, and the primary email address. So let's now start our scripting. Let me just zoom in a little bit. If you remember, the first step is to fetch the subtotal amount. So for that, let's first create a variable subtotal underscore amount. So this variable is going to store the subtotal amount that we're going to fetch shortly. So in order to fetch the subtotal amount, we can make use of the first input parameter, invoice. So let me write invoice. So this input parameter holds the details of all the fields, and this is also a map. So we can apply our built-in function that is applicable to map over this input parameter. So we can apply the built-in function get. So if you can remember from the previous sessions, the get built-in function will fetch the value stored against the specified key. So, check this example in this yellow box. So this get function will fetch the value stored against the key 2 from the input map. And the map is defined here. And if you check this map, the value stored against the key 2 is blue. So map.get of 2 will return the value blue, which will be stored in the variable ret. So let's perform something very similar to this. So we're going to fetch the subtotal amount using the function get, and we can find the key from the list by clicking on the first input parameter. We scroll down, you can find subtotal underscore total, which is the key that you're looking for. So you can simply copy this and paste it here. So this statement invoice.get of subtotal amount will fetch the subtotal amount of the current invoice, and the fetched value will be stored in the variable subtotal underscore amount. So let's now try to display this using our debug statement info subtotal amount. So the info statement displays the value stored against the variable subtotal amount. So let's try and test the script. If you click on save and execute, so here you'll have to provide the invoice ID on which we want this custom function to be acted. So if you click here, it lists all the invoices that is available in your account, and you can choose one to test your script. Let me choose the second one addressed to Jake Long. So this is the invoice ID, and if you click execute, the script will be executed. 3,700 is the value stored in the variable subtotal amount. So this log messages is really helpful when you want to debug your script. So the info statement doesn't just displays the value stored against the variable, but it basically displays any value at all. Let's try and provide different values to our info statement. Let's now first click close and info, and let me provide a text, maybe hello. So this statement should display the value hello. And not just text, we can actually provide any data type, including number, date, time, or Boolean. So let us also try with a number value. So this statement should output the number 24. Let's try to execute the script. I'm choosing the same invoice and click on execute. So 3,700 is the subtotal amount that is fetched from the current invoice, and hello is the text or the output of the second info statement, and 24 is the output of the third info statement, which is the number. So like I said, these log messages are really helpful for debug purposes. Like you might have made a mistake while scripting, but you might not be able to pinpoint where exactly the problem is. So during that situation, info statement and log messages are really helpful. So let's close this, and we don't want these two lines anymore, so I'm deleting it. So back to our example, now we have our subtotal amount. The next step is to find the discount, which is 10% of the subtotal amount. So let's first create a variable. Let me call it discount underscore amount. Discount underscore amount. So this is the variable that is going to hold this, the calculated discount amount. So in order to calculate, we'll have to multiply 0.10 with this subtotal amount. So let me copy this and paste it here. But we have a problem here. The value that has been fetched using this statement is of text data type. So in order to perform mathematical operations on that, we will first have to convert the text data type into number. So for that, let's make use of the built-in function toNumber. The toNumber built-in function will convert the text into number. So if you check this example, 81.34 is clearly a text because it is enclosed with double quotes, and the toNumber built-in function will convert this text into number. So let's make use of this function. Now subtotal amount dot toNumber will output a number. Now we can perform multiplication operation over that. So I'm going to multiply 0.10 with the subtotal amount. Now subtotal amount dot toNumber into 0.10 will return 10% of the subtotal amount fetched in the previous step, and the value will be stored in the variable discount amount. So let's now display our discount value that we've calculated. Now let me copy this variable and paste it here. So this statement should display the discount amount that we just calculated. Now click on execute and click on, let me choose the same invoice to test and click on execute. So 3,700 is the subtotal amount and 370 is the discount amount, which is 10% of the subtotal amount. Now we'll have to update this discount amount in the discount field using the integration task update records, Zoho Books update records. Let me close this and let's write our last step. So let me create a variable to store the response of the integration task, and we call it response. Zoho dot, the service name is books, and the action that we want to perform is update records. So let me make use of this autocomplete feature. The integration task expects us to provide the module name as first parameter. So here the module name is invoices. So invoices. And the second parameter should be the organization ID. And you can get the organization ID from the second input parameter, organization. So let us first create a variable to store the organization ID. Let's call it org_ID. Now this is going to hold the ID of the organization. So like I said, let's make use of the second input parameter, organization, which is also a map. So we can make use of the get function. And get function fetches the value stored against the specified key, and the key can be fetched from the second by clicking on the second input parameter. So organization underscore ID is the key that we're looking for. So copy this and paste it here. So this statement will fetch the value stored against the key organization ID from the input map organization. So the ID of the current organization will be stored in the variable org ID. So let's copy this org ID variable and supply it as second parameter to the update records integration task. So the third parameter of the update records integration task is record ID, or in our case, invoice ID. So let's now create a variable to store this record ID. Let me call it record underscore ID. We can fetch this record ID from the first input parameter, invoice. So let me make use of it, which is also a map. So we can apply get function upon that, and the value, the required key can be fetched from the list. So invoice underscore ID is what required. So let me copy it and paste it here. This statement, let me terminate this with a semicolon. This statement fetches the ID of the current invoice, and the fetched value will be stored in the variable record underscore ID. So let's copy this and supply it as third parameter. And finally, the update records task expects us to provide the value of the field that needs to be updated. So for that, let's construct a map. Let me call the map discount underscore map is equal to map. So this statement will construct a map, and all we got to do right now is supply the discount amount that we calculated in the second step into the map. So for that, let's make use of the built-in function put. So if you check this example, the put function will insert the specified key and value into the source map. If you check this example, this statement will insert the key 3 and value LO into the input map. So the map before inserting the new value will look like this, and after inserting it looks like this. So we're going to make use of this built-in function to input our discount value into the discount map. So the key is discount. You can get that by clicking on the first input parameter, and the value is the calculated discount amount. So the calculated discount amount is stored in the variable discount underscore amount. We're going to copy this variable and supply it as value to this put function. And then we're also going to provide the reason why we are providing this discount as a value to this input map. So let's make use of the put function to insert the second value, which is reason, and the value could be anything. Let me say invoice exceeded $3,000. So this discount map holds the discount amount that needs to be updated in the required field. So let's copy this and paste it here. So we supplied our last parameter to our integration task, Zoho Books update records integration task. Now click on save. So our custom function is done. Now the next step is to define when to trigger this custom function. So that can be done by using workflow rules. So navigate to workflow rules and click on new workflow rule. So in order to configure a workflow rule, we'll have to follow 4 steps. The first step is to provide a name to our workflow, and then we'll have to choose the module upon which we want this workflow to be active. And in the second step, we will tell when to trigger this workflow. And in the third step, we will tell on what conditions we want this workflow to be executed. And finally, in the fourth step, we'll have to associate the custom function that we've created. So let's get to it. So the first step, let's provide a workflow rule, name for this workflow rule. Let me call it invoice exceeded $3,000. So let's also provide an optional description. Provide 10% offer for invoices over $3,000. Click on next, and in the second step, we'll have to tell when to execute this workflow rule. So we want this to be executed every time an invoice is created. So let's choose created here and click next. And the condition is, to be precise, we want this to be executed only when the subtotal amount is greater than $3,000. So let's choose subtotal as field, and the comparator is greater than or equal to, and finally the value is 3,000. So click on next, and finally let's associate the custom function that we just created with this workflow. So choose custom function as type and choose the custom function name from the list and click save. So with this, we have successfully configured a workflow rule so that every time an invoice exceeds $3,000, automatically a 10% discount will be applied on that invoice. So with this example, I believe you would have got an idea of how to use Deluge in Zoho Books. Now let's move on to our next product, Zoho Desk. So what is Zoho Desk? So Zoho Desk is a cloud-based help desk software for your business. Imagine you have a huge customer base and you always believe that happy customers is the key for a stable business. So collating customer feedbacks is really crucial for you, and you have a pile of them to keep track of. So using Desk, you can stay on top of all your product questions, complaints, and queries while ensuring a good customer experience. So let's consider a few times that your food manufacturing business would require Deluge's automation in Zoho Desk. So you always respond to your customers at the earliest time possible, but it is tiring to keep up the work when a ticket is generated in a non-business hour. So you want to automate this process such that an auto-generated email will be sent to the customer who has raised the ticket during a non-business hour. So you can do that using Deluge, and as of custom function, the only thing that you want to do is to write a send mail task that is addressed to the email of the customer who has raised the ticket. So let's check how this can be done. I have now logged into my Zoho Desk account. So click on setup icon. Here choose workflows. Now navigate to custom functions and click on new custom function. So Zoho Desk offers you a ready to deploy set of custom functions in Gallery. So you can simply choose one among the list and configure them with the workflow and then get it working. Otherwise, you can also choose to write your own script. So for our case, let's write our own script. So let me choose write your own and choose the module upon which you want this custom function to be active. In our case, it is tickets. And provide the custom function a name. Let me call it send email, and provide an optional description and auto-generated email. So if you can remember, the input parameters in Zoho Books were supplied by default based on the module that we have chosen. But here we have an option to configure our own input parameters. So for that, click on Edit Arguments in the title bar of Deluge Editor. Now, the only dynamic value that we require here is the email address of the customer who has raised the ticket, right? So let's choose email address as the dynamic value or the input parameter and give this input parameter a name. Let me call it email. So you can think of this name as name of a variable that dynamically stores the email address of the customer who has raised the ticket. So click on Done. Now, if you check, our header for the custom function has been configured with the email like input parameter that we just configured. So now, as of script, we will have to write one send mail task. Send mail, and the from address should be addressed to admin user ID. For that, let's make use of the system variable zoho.admin user ID. And the to address should be the email address of the customer who has raised the ticket. So let's choose email, which is the input parameter that we've configured here. And let's also provide a subject. Let me call it thanks for writing to us. And a message. We will get back to you at the earliest. So click on save, and that's it for the custom function. We have written our custom function. So all we got to do right now is to configure a workflow rule to trigger this custom function. For that, navigate to rules and click on create rule. So here we have to perform the same 4 steps that we did for our Zoho Books example. That is, in the first step, we'll have to provide the module name and the workflow name. So let's provide workflow name. Let me call it auto-generated email. And provide an optional description. Send emails to customers. And click next. So in the second step, we'll have to provide when to trigger the custom function. So in our case, we want the custom function to be triggered every time an email like as a ticket is generated. So let's click on create and click next. So in the third step, we'll have to provide the conditions based on which we want this custom function to be triggered. So in our case, the condition is the ticket should be generated outside the business hours, right? So let's choose execution time is outside business hours of business hours. Please note that in order to make use of this criteria, you would have already configured your business hours in Zoho Desk. So go to setup icon, configure your business hours before you make use of the script. And then click next. And finally, we will have to associate the custom function that we've written. For that, click on the plus icon and choose existing custom function and select the required custom function and click save. So now we have configured a workflow rule. So every time a ticket is generated during a non-business hour, an automated custom message will be sent to the customer who has raised the ticket. So another such example is, what if we want to notify your team about all the high priority tickets through Zoho Click channel? So you can actually perform that by using an integration task, Zoho Click post to channel as an admin task. So here you'll have to supply your custom message that needs to be posted in the Click channel as one of the parameters of this integration task, and that's it. So let's check how this can be done. I have now logged into my Zoho Desk account. So click on Custom Functions. And click on New Custom Function button and choose Write Your Own and select the module upon which you want this custom function to be active, which is tickets in our case. And give your custom function a name. Let's call it Post to Channel. An optional description, Post to Channel in Zoho Click. So as of input parameters, the only dynamic value that we require here is the ticket number, so that we can append the ticket number along with the custom message that we're going to post in the Zoho Click channel. So let's configure that. Click on Edit Arguments and choose ticket numbers from the drop-down list and give the parameter a value, a name, ticket underscore number, and click Done. So before we start to write the script, let us log into the Zoho Click account and check the channel on which we want to post this custom message. So let's say we want to post this message in the channel theme. So click on the icon, channel icon, and navigate to connectors. Here you can see the deluge task has been listed here. So this is the task that is responsible to post a custom message in this channel. So let's copy this and paste it in the Zoho Desk account. Let me copy this task and navigate back to Zoho Desk account and paste it here. So let me also create a variable to store the response of this integration task. I'm calling it response. So if you check, the first parameter is the unique name provided to the channel in Zoho Click. And the second parameter is the custom message that has to be posted in the Zoho Click channel. We can actually edit it and provide a required message. Let me say, team, take a look at this high priority ticket. And let us also associate the ticket number using the concatenation operator plus, and we can get the ticket number from the input parameter that we've configured. So let me copy this ticket number parameter and paste it here. So this should send our custom message in the channel named team. So let's test if the script is working. For that, click on Save and Execute Script. So here, let us provide a dummy value. Let me call 100 to be the ticket number and click Done. So our custom message has been posted here in the channel. So our script is working. Now all we got to do is, so click on Save, and now what we got to do is to define when to trigger this custom function. For that, we're going to make use of workflow rules. So click on Create Rule. And here we're going to follow the same 4 steps. So in the first step, let us provide the rule name and the module, which is ticket. So let me call it notify theme. And also provide an optional description. Notify theme about high priority tickets. So click Next. And we want this custom function to be triggered every time a ticket is created or the priority field is edited. So let me choose priority from the field update and also choose the create option. So in the next step, we'll have to tell on what condition we want this custom function to be triggered. So which is the priority field should be set to high. So let's choose priority as field name, and the comparator is and the value is high. And finally, in the last step, we'll have to associate the custom function that we just created along with this workflow rule. So let's click on the plus icon and click on existing custom function and choose the custom function that we just configured and click on Save. So with this, we have successfully configured our workflow rule to post a custom message in the Zoho Click channel every time a ticket has been set to a ticket is set to high priority. So with this, our desk examples are done. So not just Zoho Desk and Zoho Books, you can actually achieve customization, automation, and integration in any Zoho service that supports Deluge editor. So let's consider some of such other use cases. The first example that I've provided here is about Zoho Sheets. So Zoho Sheets is a spreadsheet software where you can create, edit, share sheets online. So here you can create custom formulae using Deluge. Like imagine you have 3 columns that contains the details of principal, rate, and number of years. So you can actually write a custom function using deluge that will evaluate and reevaluate simple interest every time a cell in those three columns has been updated. So custom functions in Zoho Sheet will act like macros. So the second example that I've provided is about Zoho Recruit. Zoho Recruit is a cloud-based application tracking software for your hiring process. So here you can write custom function to perform to filter your resumes based on custom criteria. So for example, you can reject all the resumes that does not have a proper contact information like email or phone number. So for that you can automate it by writing a custom function in Deluge. And the third example that I've provided is about Zoho CRM. So as the name specifies, the Zoho CRM is a customer relationship management software. So with this, you can keep track of all your leads, your customers, your sales, and everything that's related to sales. And there are plenty of examples that I mean, with respect to Deluge in Zoho CRM. And one such example is getting notified about idle leads periodically. And finally, the last example is about Zoho Mail. So Zoho Mail is an email software. Um, so here you can use Deluge to filter your emails or to perform some custom actions based on the emails that you receive. So one such example is you can post the content of all the emails that has been received from this specific email address in the Zoho Click channel. So that is it for this session. I really hope you found this useful and you got an idea of how to use Deluge in different Zoho services. Thank you.